Welcome to this symposium on overt and covert antisocial behavior, in other words, aggression and misleading antisocial acts. And I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Rolf Loeber. I'm at the University of Pittsburgh. But as some of you already asked, my accent is Dutch originally, and I'm Canadian as well. So there you are, international, as many of you are here. So I'm going to present first, then we have two other presentations, and Richard Tremblay will comment, and Daniel Nagin will be discussant. Okay, so let me see if I can start this. There we are. Okay. It's not playing on the screen. It's on my computer here, but could you project, please? No, it's not as bad as yesterday. I threw a glass of water over the computer, and one part of the presentation was cancelled. There you are. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So the intertwined development of overt and covert antisocial behavior. For those of you interested in biographies and the way that individuals develop, actually, I was thinking about this problem when I was an undergraduate many decades ago. And it's very strange to actually be here and just actually try to address this problem. I knew that this problem was very vexing, and I knew that you needed different data for that than cross-sectional data. Of course, setting up longitudinal studies is a huge job. It's very costly. I had no idea that eventually I was able to do that with my colleagues in Pittsburgh. So, as I said, overt and covert antisocial behavior. So, we're talking about aggression, violence, but also misleading behaviors, including lying and theft, as just examples. So, of course, I don't do this alone, and I just want to acknowledge particularly my wife, with whom I've been able to work together for decades, and also, you know, start the longitudinal studies. But I want to also mention for this presentation Leah Ahonen, David Farrington, Alison Hipwell, Mark Leblanc, Dustin Bardini, Rebecca Stallings, Stephanie Stepp, and Richard. Richard has been a shining light in my life, with pointing me to many developmental aspects of his data, and I was very happy to be in Montreal for some time to work with him on analysis. Many of you recognize this statue of an angry boy, and the aggression, of course, is played out by children in many different ways. And this is a picture I recently took in Venice, and you see the boy behind the open well, and you know, it has a gun. It's a play gun, but it has pellets. So he's acting out aggression on his playmates, including the girls, by the way. Also in Venice, I saw this statue of Pinocchio, and with his long nose and the lying. You know, we were always told that, yes, if you lie very often, you know, your nose will get longer. So Pinocchio-like. In Holland, I saw this announcement about kids who are defiant and crying out, and how difficult it is. So we will talk about these, well, not innocuous, but these behaviors that are difficult to define as aggression, but they fall really in the area of disobedience. So we need to understand the development of antisocial behavior, and it's not just overt and covert behaviors, as we will see as I go along. But basically, we're going to talk about diversification of behaviors over time. What are these processes like, and why do they happen? Why is it that some kids have very diverse antisocial behaviors, large numbers of them, so to say, and others not? So, and eventually become multi-problem youth, and that's many of you will have seen these youngsters. So when antisocial problems become diversified, earlier problems usually are retained rather than substituted. This is important to know this. So in other words, we're talking about a larger number of problem behaviors evolving over time. And at the same time, some of these kids will escalate in the severity of these problem behaviors. So escalation and diversification often go hand in hand, escalation and severity. So you might think about teasing as a form of aggression, especially if it happens in a frequent way. And then eventually at the other end of the dimension, you will have violence. So the escalation processes, diversification processes, and also the retention of these problem behaviors over time are important concepts for you to kind of think about how these behaviors unfold over time. So at the same time, criminologists are interested in specialization versus versatility or generalized offending. So some individuals specialize on, say, burglary. Others might specialize on various forms of aggressive forms of violence. So versatility or generalized offending and specialization are other concepts that are really important because they become basically things for us to explain. So what we're going to do today is basically look at how overt and covert antisocial behaviors unfold over time. And I'm calling on Richard Tremblay's work particularly because of his work at a very young age. So well, I will also cover the interplay between overt and covert antisocial behaviors and substance use, because substance use is part and parcel of this diversification process. So an example here, this is Richard Tremblay's data. As you remember, that boys and girls show aggression at a young age, and that eventually actually decreases with age. So this is a very important phenomenon, and I won't take away Richard's fire, so to say, but this has been a major kind of paradigm shift for us to think differently about antisocial behavior development. However, there's another form of development that takes place 1.5 decades later, and that's the one shown here. And that's actually, this is Pittsburgh data, and it's self-reported frequency of moderate and serious violence. The two cohorts in white is the oldest sample. So you can see here that there's a gradual increase from age 11 to peaking around age 19 to 20 in really quite serious forms of violence. The younger cohort is also peaking a little bit earlier, but this is something that is very clear in the data. That on the one hand, there is a manifestation of aggression very early in life, which decreases, and then there is the manifestation of antisocial or a violent type of crime that really increases in late adolescence and then peaks in that period and then decreases. So this is an important contrast in which, so that whatever we learn from the earlier period doesn't mean that it necessarily are the same individuals. Some are. Some will be kind of what Moffat called life course persistent, antisocial individuals, but not everyone. So this is a big puzzle about who's who in these developments, and is there escalation over time? So also you should realize that although we have been talking really about the offenders or the antisocial kids so far, the victim surveys actually also shed light on the co-occurrence of different types of offenses. So for example, in the Swedish crime survey, the recent one, 2016, 13% of the victims stated that during the course of the past year, they were exposed to both personal offenses and covert or fraud offenses and harassment. So it's not just the offenders that we're interested in, it's also the victims, and many victims are exposed to both overt and covert antisocial acts. So what I'm going to do today is talk about developmental pathways, because we somehow have to resolve the issue about how these problem behaviors evolve over long periods of time. We want to look at the co-occurrence of covert and overt behaviors, because that's part of the theme of this symposium. I want to briefly touch on biological causes and psychosocial ones. I want to talk about escalation and its in overt and covert acts, and the escalation in substance use. Okay, so the first one is developmental pathways from minor towards serious antisocial acts. So all of you have seen aggressive kids, and you have to kind of think about it, what makes an aggressive kid into a violent offender? And eventually, who gets victimized in the process? So what are the bases of the distinction first between overt and covert behaviors? Now, they are opposite ends of an antisocial dimension. Now, that's easily said, but it's actually based on mostly factor analysis that showed that there are different sides to these different clusters in the factors, and that's replicated in literally hundreds of studies. Moreover, meta-analysis that summarize these factor analysis clearly show that antisocial behavior has a dimension with overt behaviors on one pole and covert behaviors on the other. So what about then the distinction in terms of onset? Onset of overt behaviors for the most males tend to be earlier than the onset of covert behaviors. I think this is also true for the at young age. It's certainly true in late adolescence, early adulthood. Now, part of the problem of diversification is actually also to understand desistance. So some kids will drop out, they will stop problematic behaviors. But we know that desistance of overt behaviors tends to be, on average, lower than desistance in covert behaviors. So there's something about aggression that is persisting more over the life course than these covert acts. So what we did, we developed 3 pathways and as a model, because you need to have models to test. And this model started out with saying, okay, we have a distinction between overt and covert behaviors, and then there is disobedience type of behaviors, which we call authority avoidance, and that's really in the central part of that distribution between overt and covert. So in order to develop this model, we then said, okay, it has to be a stepwise model with testing basically whether kids who are stubborn and defiant eventually become truant. And is there a progression that is most of those who are truant have been defiant and disobedient, stubborn earlier in life. So that's as far as authority avoidance goes. But we also looked then at the overt pathway, and we basically postulated that there are different steps, 3 steps in here, and that is at the top is violence, including rape, attacking, and strong arming, and homicide. And then second step is physical fighting, and minor aggression being below that. The idea basically is that individuals who have escalated to the top here, as a rule, and the data clearly show this, have gone through prior steps in the development over time, in the order as displayed. So most of those who became violent have started out with minor forms of aggression, physical fighting, and then violence. Now, you should understand, although this is data-based, it's also limited by the data. In this case, it refers to males, and they were studied first around age 7. So we're missing really this important period that Richard has been working on. On the right-hand side, you see then the covert behaviors, but basically also stepwise progression with the most serious forms of delinquency on top, including car theft and burglary, but minor problem behavior, minor covert behaviors are earlier feeding into this. And those who escalate to the top actually are the ones that actually have gone through these preceding steps. As you can understand, there are exceptions, but basically, statistically speaking, these steps in the pathways have been demonstrated. So, in terms of victims, as you understand, overt behaviors have more victims than, say, the authority avoidance has. So this is basically victimless. But the cost of victim increases from minor aggression to violence. So, but I should have mentioned, by the way, that on top here, we eventually also inserted homicide because of the homicide offenders that we have in our Pittsburgh example. But basically, 95% of the homicide offenders were known to have been violent, earlier in life. Okay, so increasing victim costs as you go up the pathways, and this is true for the covert behaviors as well. So in terms of variation, people can be on, or young people can be on 3 pathways at the same time. So this is not a mutually exclusive model. So, and this is important. So diversification could be in terms of kids being on the overt pathway, could be on the covert pathway, and certainly many of them will be on this authority avoidance pathway. Also, escalation means that minor problem behaviors at the bottom of these pyramids, and kids tend to progress through this. Now, it's not a compulsory kind of process, that is, it doesn't mean that if you're in a lower step, you have to rise to the top. That's not the case at all. So it's forward probability, so to say. The earlier the age of onset, the more likely individual will escalate to the top. So that's an important principle to keep in mind. We know that early onset is associated with chronicity, but it's escalation in the severity and diversification that is really part and parcel of the problem of early onset. In terms of desistance, the further you go actually up the pathways, the less desistance. So the earlier problem behaviors, the minor problem behaviors, I think have higher degree of desistance. But the research in this area is much poorer than the research on escalation, so there's still much to be learned. Are the 2 behaviors, overt and covert, interchangeable? The answer is no. Young males who escalate in the overt pathway are at risk to escalate in the covert pathway as well. So there's something compelling about overt pathway in terms of the probability of entering the covert pathway. And in contrast, youths who initially are in the covert pathway are lesser at risk of escalating in the overt pathway. So this is very important in terms of developmental ordering, of course. Now, the research in this area is not without controversy, and I'll come back to this at a later point. Now, not all kids are going to be persisters in antisocial behavior. So although they may rise to a next level, what is really important is to make a distinction between experimenters and persisters. So some kids will show problem behaviors for short periods of time, and that doesn't mean they're going to be tomorrow's serious criminal. So these experimenters, they desist basically, and the processes of this experimentation and desistance are far from clear. So most of the persisters enter a pathway at the first step, but fewer persisters compared to experimenters enter a pathway at later steps. So developmental ordering is important here. And so the identification of a pathway is helped by leaving out the noise caused by experimenters. So, there's obviously lots of kind of development that goes up and down, so to say. Once you start to extract that from data sets, then these pathways become even clearer. So, of course, I won't have much opportunity today to talk about interventions, but as you can imagine, interventions for persisters can take place particularly at the early steps in the pathway. That's the way, we'd like to do that. Now, the analysis for overt and covert behaviors have been done in a variety of ways, and of course, Daniel Nagin, who's here, has been pioneering with Richard the analysis of trajectories, which is basically a classification of individuals in an empirical fashion. So, with the help of Eric Lacourse, who also worked with Richard, we analyzed these trajectories for overt and covert behaviors, and this was published in this particular book. And the conclusions was that by using a non-parametric random effects model, we identified different groups of individuals whose development varied in terms of onset, rate of change, and duration of offending. And we found 2 to 4 developmental trajectories for violence and theft in the 2 cohorts that we have. Desistance from theft happened earlier than desistance from violence, a theme that I mentioned a little earlier, which I think is very, very important. The results indicate violence specialization, but not theft specialization. And in both cohorts, the groups of violent offenders who were low in theft, but the counterpart of serious theft offenders not engaging in violence was rare or non-existent. I should warn you, though, that this is contrary to other analysis. So the jury is really out about how covert and overt behaviors combine and what the direction of the effects are. But still, I think each set of analysis tends to kind of challenge the idea that the processes are certainly not random. Now, much has been written about causation, about antisocial behavior, and it's a topic that is too large for me to cover today. But I just want to focus on biological causes. One is, Richard is very interested in this, of course, and just want to summarize a few things that are particularly the research by Ted Barker. And he, in a twin study, showed stronger genetic compared to environmental effects for aggression compared to deceitful or covert juvenile behaviors. So this is important to keep in mind. It doesn't mean that aggression is fully biologically or genetically determined. That's not the argument here. It's clear kids can learn aggression. Patterson's work is very seminal in this respect. There are coercive interchanges between parents and their children, between peers and children. So, aggression can be learned. But what we also, of course, have learned from Richard's work is that aggression is a natural phenomenon early in life. So the question then is are the biological effects, and particularly genetic effects, already programmed, so to say, and can they be changed? And is this also true for violence emerging later in life? There are major issues to be resolved. Now, the controversies in the study of biology and crime, I just want to emphasize one of them, and that is most of the studies assume stability of individual differences and ignore developmental change. So this is a handicap of many of the biological studies. The causal status of factors are usually demonstrated in between group studies, which is very difficult to establish actually causality. And so what we really need to do is much more focus on within individual change in these biological studies. And those studies are actually very rare and really need to be pursued. Let me see if I can advance this. So individual difference approach is a basic problem because this is a key element in several theories, but it assumes that individual differences originate in childhood. It assumes that relative stability of these behaviors over time, and it assumes also that individual differences proportionally stay the same over time. All these things are verifiable by statistical analysis if you have the right data, of course. And this is why these studies, starting in infancy, are so important. So I'm trying to advance the slides, but it's difficult. It's very slow. But individual approach has basic problems and is a key element in several theories. And I'm just listing only a few of them. So the relative stability of individual differences is not supported by two types of data. The vast majority of trajectory models show great diversity of trajectories with age. And Picara's review and then Nagin's work, of course, has clearly shown this. Age crime curve literature is also important. Remember, the age crime curve is that the crime tends to gradually increase with age, particularly during, say, roughly age 12 to 13, depending on the gender, and then starts to peak in later adolescence, early adulthood, and then reduces. So the explanation of the age crime curve is important, particularly in the context of overt and covert antisocial behavior development during the juvenile years. For some reason, the computer is very slow in reacting to my pressing it. So let's move on to substance use. So on the one hand, we've seen overt and covert behavior and development over time. So what do we know about substance use? We know that many of the delinquents use substances of a variety of kinds, and alcohol, marijuana, hard drugs sometimes. And so the question then is, how does overt and covert behavior relate to not only the use of substances, but escalation and severity of substances? And Helene White has used our data to analyze this in great detail, and it shows basically that the higher the frequency of alcohol and marijuana use, the greater the risk of young males moving from the lowest to the highest level in both pathways. So both the overt and covert pathways are implicated in escalation in the frequency of alcohol and marijuana use. Hard drug use compared to non-use was associated with moving from minor aggression to violence. So very important to, just not, overt pathway and the covert pathway. It's particularly the overt pathway that is implicated in the escalation to hard drug use. So I think I should stop here because these were just thoughts about the interaction between overt and covert behaviors. They are, obviously progress has been made, but there are also many issues that I pointed out to you today that haven't been resolved, that are worthy of resolving, because they're extraordinarily important to understand both prevention and intervention better. Because it's the nature of the antisocial behavior and its causes that actually form the basis for interventions to understand better when to intervene, when to have relapse prevention, who should be targeted, and who is most at risk. And I hope that today's presentation helped you to clarify some of that. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Ali and I'm a postdoc student with working with Richard and Sylvana based in University of Bordeaux. And thanks to Rolf Loeber for explaining the conceptual underpinning of the conceptual perspective underpinning the talks that we are going through today. My talk is about an empirical examination of part of the talk that Rolf talked about at the way that the antisocial behaviors evolve over time. So what I'm going today to explain is to see how the childhood physical and indirect aggression are associated with antisocial behaviors in adolescence. As Rolf explained, there are different types of antisocial behaviors, and overt and covert behaviors, and they have different developmental trajectories and are distinct. And the literature that Richard has been working on shows that the physical, and there are different types of aggression that develop through childhood. The two more common ones is physical aggression and indirect aggression. Richard and his team has shown that they have different developmental trajectories and they have different outcomes. For instance, the indirect and social aggression, because it requires more cognitive capacity, they might lead to more sophisticated form of antisocial behaviors later in time, mostly the covert antisocial behaviors, including stealing and rule breaking. So now, without going through repeating the same conceptual framework, I'm going to present the results and objectives and the results of this study. So what I'm going to identify the combined developmental multi-trajectory of the physical and indirect aggression, and to describe the demographics of each trajectory, and also to examine the association of the trajectories with later antisocial behaviors. We are using the Quebec longitudinal study of child development, LDEC, that includes 2,223 participants. And we are using multi-trajectory analysis. And what we are using this method to identify the trajectory of physical and indirect aggression from age 6 to 13. We're using the teacher's evaluation from 6 to 13, and also the self-report evaluation from 10 to 13. And the outcomes were measured at 15 and 17 years. And for the overt aggression, we are measuring violence, and the covert aggression, we measured theft. To explain what multi-trajectory analysis is, I'm going to sort of contrast the multi-trajectory modeling with the single trajectory modeling. This is the trajectory of physical aggression that Richard and Daniel Nagin published in 1999. So the trajectory modeling shows the development of a behavior, in this case physical aggression, over time, and the distinct group of individuals that follow the same developmental trajectory. In this case, the physical aggression followed 4 different trajectories from age 6 to age 15. In multi-modeling, though, it goes through these developmental trajectories across different indicators. And in this case, the physical aggression, it shows that how many different trajectories of physical aggression we have, and what are the developmental trajectories of other forms of behaviors in each trajectory, which in this case, the violent delinquency, drug abuse, and the sexual partnership, number of sexual partnership. And so to contrast it again, a single trajectory just shows the number of individuals following the same developmental trajectory in single indicator, but the multi-trajectory shows the same process across different indicators. So by analyzing the physical and indirect aggression during school years, we found there are 3 distinct developmental trajectories, which this is for boys' developmental trajectory of physical and indirect aggression. As you can see, the first group that shows no sign of physical and indirect aggression makes up 36% of the population, and as you can see, there is no sign of aggression in this trajectory. The second trajectory shows that comprises 50% of participants show low level of these behavior across different raters and across different behaviors, the indirect aggression and physical aggression. The third group that in this case is the chronic one only comprises the 14% of the sample, and as you can see, there's a high level of both physical aggression and indirect aggression. And in terms of the teacher's evaluation, you see there's a decreasing level of physical aggression, but the indirect aggression has a curve sort of developmental trajectory in this case. And this is the developmental trajectory, multi-trajectory of the girls' physical and indirect aggression. And there's a clear group membership differences. As you can see here, the majority of girls fall into the low multi-trajectory, the first group that display very low level or no sign of physical and indirect aggression, comprising almost 60% of the participants. The second group that, based on the teacher's report, they are showing low level of aggression, but based on the self-report, it's a medium developmental trajectory. They are sort of comprising 27% of the sample. Just one note in this case that we couldn't calculate the physical aggression for girls in this group because there was very low variance in terms of the physical aggression. So we had to recode the physical aggression to logit model, and part of the reason you see there's a high level in the self-report is because it's what's recorded to increase the variance of the aggressive category in this case. And the chronic group that comprises 13% of the sample, they have high decreasing level of physical and indirect aggression in this case. We also analyzed the risk factors that might lead to the chronic group. This is multi-nominal regression model that compares the chronic group with the low aggressive trajectory, which in this case you see there are significant differences between the chronic group and the base outcome, the low trajectory, and the differences is more evident in boys than girls. And just to quickly go through it, lower parental education, lower IQ, lower household income, and lower socioeconomic status, and higher parental depression, and higher number of siblings, and for girls, the higher father's antisocial behaviors, and the opposite for boys, higher mother's antisocial behavior, and we didn't find significant differences in mother's age at first childbirth. And to see how different trajectories lead to different outcomes, we found significant effect of the chronic trajectory to both violence and theft at boys and girls together. In this case, because we looked at the co-occurrence of the physical aggression and indirect aggression, we see the significant effect on the two different types of the aggression that Rolf was explaining. They have distinct developmental trajectory. So what we did here is the sort of showing how the co-occurrence of physical and indirect aggression would lead to later antisocial behaviors, and that would link the different types of aggression to later development of later display of violence and theft behaviors. And we saw that there are clear sex differences, and one of the main one is the percentage of the group membership in the no aggressive trajectory, and also the association with outcome. We see that there's a stronger relationship in the girls with the there's a stronger relationship with the theft in the girls group compared to violence, but there's the similar effect for both antisocial behaviors in boys. There is a limitation in this study that there's a large missing values for in sort of the teacher's assessment of physical and indirect aggression, and the low number of participants in the chronic group. For instance, for each cell, we have a low number of the trajectory in boys' trajectory that fall into sort of the category of committing violence. And there was a very low number of participants in that group. And the future direction might include more factors that might influence these different developmental trajectories. As I explained earlier, that Richard's work has shown there's a clear cognitive capacity differences across different types of aggressive behaviors, and one important future direction would be to see how the cognitive capacity would impact the developmental trajectory itself, and also the effect of these developmental trajectories on later antisocial behaviors. And thank you.
Vergunst. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University of Montreal, working with Sylvana Côté and Richard Tremblay. I'm going to continue a little bit talking about what Rolf and Ali have just introduced. I'm going to focus on some empirical work that we've been carrying out in the last couple of months using trajectory modeling. And I'm going to focus on particularly the role of self-control in early childhood and how that predicts overt and covert aggression in childhood, particularly theft and aggression. So we've already heard a little bit about different manifestations of aggression. On the one hand, we have overt aggression, which often manifests as opposition and defiance and physical aggression, and on the other hand, more covert forms of aggression, which often manifest as rule-breaking and vandalism and theft. As Rolf said already, overt aggression tends to have an earlier onset, and the frequency of aggressive events tends to desist with age, whereas covert aggression tends to have a slightly later onset, and the frequency tends to increase with age. An interesting question with regards to these two different forms of aggression is does it represent some different underlying developmental phenotype? Is there some underlying mechanism that might explain these two different forms of aggression? So one possibility is that it reflects differences in early childhood levels of self-control. So the self-control hypothesis in criminology is of course very well established as an explanation for antisocial behavior. And in the last few years, there's been quite a lot of progress made in terms of thinking about how to conceptualize and measure self-control. And one behavioral approximation for childhood self-control is symptoms of hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention. So what we wanted to do in this study was see whether childhood symptoms of self-control between 1.5 years and 8 years, based on mother reports of their own child's behavior, whether those symptoms predicted overt or covert behavior in adolescence, that is at 15 and 17 years. So initially, we identified the different symptom trajectories between 1.5 and 8 years using group-based multi-trajectory modeling. Then we looked at the child and parent and family characteristics of children following different developmental trajectories. And then finally, we used regression models to test whether there's a relationship between group membership in those different trajectories and antisocial behavior in adolescence. As Ali said already, this is the same sample. It's a Canadian birth cohort from the French-speaking province of Quebec. The study's been running for almost 20 years now, and we have behavioral ratings in the early years from mothers on hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention. And in this study, we combined the symptoms of hyperactivity, impulsivity as one symptom dimension, and inattention as the other symptom dimension. And then we put those into a multi-trajectory model and generated trajectories for both of those symptoms. And I'll show you those in a moment. In terms of outcomes, we used violence at 15 and 17 years, so any event of violence at either 15 or 17 years. Violent events included things like physical fights, using a weapon in a fight, being involved in gang fights. For theft, we used things like stealing items or money from home or from school, breaking into property to steal things. Because of the distribution of the data, we used the inclusion criteria for that, there had to be some event of theft at 15 and 17 years. So once we had our trajectories, so those are the trajectories for the boys. What we see on the x-axis, so at the bottom we have age in years, and on the right, on the left-hand figure, we have hyperactivity, impulsivity, and on the left we have inattention. So you have to imagine that these two symptom dimensions have been combined into a single model, and we're effectively seeing children that are following the same developmental trajectories in both of those symptom dimensions, so hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention. So there's a couple of interesting features in this trajectory model. We see at the top a chronic group, about 6% of boys who from very early on are following high symptom trajectories of hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention. And then there's another interesting group, which is the green group. And those boys, they're starting with relatively low levels of symptoms, but during the course of childhood, those symptoms are climbing. And actually, by the time they reach about 7 years, they're actually passing the high symptom or chronic group. These are the symptoms trajectories for girls. We analyze boys and girls separately because developmentally within the literature we know that patterns of aggression are quite different. What you see here, it's just interesting to compare. You can see overall the symptom levels are lower compared to boys. There's also a chronic group, about 7% of girls following a high symptom trajectory from birth to 8 years. But there's no rising group. The other groups tend to follow moderate or low desisting trajectories. So once we have our symptom trajectories, we have a specified group membership, and we can use those as a predictor for later outcomes, in this case, aggression in adolescence. So just briefly run over the associations. Ali talked about these. They're quite similar. What we see here is that boys and girls following the high symptom trajectories or the rising symptom trajectory in the case of boys, in general, they come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, lower IQ, less educated mothers, younger mothers. They're more likely to have used methylphenidate, Ritalin, at some point during their lives. And for the girls, maternal antisocial behavior seems to be a significant factor as well as coming from a non-intact family. Here are the logistic regression models. What we see, so I'm only presenting logistic regression models for boys. We didn't actually find any associations between symptom group membership and social outcomes in adolescence for girls. So for boys, what we see is that in the chronic group, the red group at the top, there's an association, a significant association between belonging to that group compared to belonging to the lowest groups for being involved in violence, physical violence in adolescence. Odds ratio of 3.3, it's not huge, and a p-value of 0.33, again, it's not tiny. And a very interesting feature in this analysis was the emergence of this rising group, which was significantly associated with theft in adolescence. Again, odds ratio of 0.55 and p-value of 0.000. What are these data? What can we learn from these results? Well, there's some interesting sex differences in terms of boys, at least on these particular symptom dimensions, this approximation for self-control. Boys both groups have a single chronic group that follows a high symptom trajectory from early on to 8 years. But boys additionally have this group of this rising group that have a slightly later onset. And that later onset seems to be associated with a different kind of antisocial behavior. In some ways, it seems quite predictable that the group of boys following the chronic symptom trajectory, that group is associated with violence in adolescence. There's already a well-established literature that children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder are at increased risk for antisocial behavior, crime in adulthood. So that's perhaps predictable. In terms of the rising group, I think that's less clear. It's possible that these children have, if we look at the symptom trajectories, we see that they start with relatively average levels of self-control in early childhood. But pretty quickly, those change, and the symptoms start to climb quite fast. And perhaps that represents some other kind of developmental pathway, and that their levels of self-control in some ways are different to the chronic group, and perhaps that results in some different forms of antisocial behavior. It doesn't seem to be related to IQ. If we look at intelligence at 10 years in the chronic group versus the rising group, there aren't any significant differences, and there also aren't any differences if we include IQ in the model. I think that's everything. Yeah, thanks.
Well, I want to thank Richard for inviting me to comment on these papers, and thank all of you at this early hour for attending. So I want to place my comments about these papers in context. Recently I've been thinking quite a bit about the testing of causal relationships in developmental research, and more generally in criminal justice research, so I'd like to comment on these presentations in this context, and to put that further in context, I just want to remind everybody of how the theory of evolution evolved. The source of it was many naturalists, including Charles Darwin, going out and observing the world, making measurements about the world and observations thereof, and then stepping back and asking themselves the question of, can I posit what he did eventually, a theory that's consistent with the empirical regularities I see out there in the world. And I think that I mean, I think we all recognize Darwin's remarkable achievement in his setting forth the theory of what we were seeing and why it was happening. But I'll just remind you that what's even more remarkable about this theory was that he did it in a time when he nor anybody knew what anything about genes or genetics, or could possibly explain exactly physiologically how the things he was predicting occurred. So in that vein, let me begin by saying, and here salute both Rolf and Richard and others like him, David Farrington, and among others, who in their work using longitudinal data have done a quite remarkable job. There's sort of like the equivalent in part of their roles of the naturalists of telling us what the empirical regularities are, and then stepping forward and then offering theories of what is consistent with the facts that they've observed in their data. And so Rolf, and he briefly described his theory, and in fact, in the child development paper that Ali showed, in part, one of the objectives of that paper was that we tested, in part, some of Rolf's predictions and indeed found support for them. Separately, Richard has offered theories, a theory in which in some ways are consistent with Rolf's, but in other ways are different, which is what good science is all about. And then the question then becomes how to go about distinguishing them and making sense of them. And here, I guess I just would want to make the comment that I'm going to be talking about actually more about in the next session in a very different domain about what do we know about procedural justice and legal compliance. But it comes to the question of how do we then begin making inferences about the underlying mechanisms that are described in the theories and the outcomes and so forth and those kinds of things. And let me begin by saying what, in the negative, what you're not going to do. And I think to a troubling, actually I'll say to a troubling degree, I'm seeing happen too often, is you're not going to figure out what the underlying mechanism, test the predictions of these theories by running ever more elaborate regression models. I think we have to understand that the world and the data that we see in the world is not generated by one giant regression model, and that people don't have intercepts and slopes. So that's not what we're going to do. Now, it's not that these kinds of statistical methods cannot be helpful, and for any of you who know my work, you'll know that I sometimes do use elaborate statistical methods. But the way we're going to ultimately understand and test these theories is through some form of experimentation. Now, that might be randomized experiments, but it doesn't have to be. And in fact, I can think of many circumstances where I would like to see something that nature calls a natural experiment that, for a variety of reasons, is better than what we would call a randomized experiment. And in that regard, I'd remind everybody that long before we had natural experiment, even the idea of what a randomized experiment was ever thought of, which is less than 100 years ago, we had scientists, some of the greatest minds in the world, making causal inferences, doing bench science, doing bench science, and not using any statistics or randomization. So therefore, there are natural experiments out there that we can do. So, for example, when Rolf was making his presentations about the various pathways to overt and covert regression, and describing the kind of the empirical regularities that led him to this conclusion, I was thinking, well, how could we go about, testing these kinds of the progressions that Rolf was mentioning, which all seemed sensible to me. Well, so the examples of the kind of natural experiments you might do is that suppose either via an experimental intervention or just because of different ways the judicial system works, at least in the US in various ways, some kids were assigned to some kind of judicial outcome treatment. Let's say were assigned to receive drug treatment, and those who were not. And if that treatment was successful in disrupting the path they were going down, we could use that as a basis for testing Rolf's theory. Or yesterday afternoon, David Weisberg had a very interesting session on epigenetics and crime hotspots, and without trying to rehash the entire discussion, Richard made this very, I think, astute and interesting observation about, well, why don't you try to embed, in this analysis that David was describing, an experimental manipulation where some crime hotspots would receive some kind of social intervention to deal with a variety of problems that David described as happening at crime hotspots, which was beyond just crime. And then Richard went on, I think, quite astutely, and pointing out the value of that, not only for policy, making better policy, but also for understanding whether the underlying causal relationships were there. So I'll just end this by saying is that I think the next step in the kind of research that was described today is to try to find circumstances and situations, whether by a randomized experiment or some cataclysmic social event. Again, I was thinking of Rolf's case. An example of that was, and this has already been studied, is that in the closing months of the Second World War, there was a famine in the Netherlands, and since then people have studied, what impact that may have had on some of the offspring of the women who were pregnant at that time. So. Again, a really very interesting set of presentations, and I commend you all.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Rolf, Mary, and Francis for these presentations. Rolf mentioned that we worked together some years ago on the data sets in Montreal, and I clearly remember that I had met Rolf a few years earlier, and he had told me that he was planning the longitudinal studies in Pittsburgh. And his thinking had impressed me, both in terms of his historical perspective on research on child development and antisocial behavior. And we had started our studies, and we had data. So I invited Rolf to come to Montreal, and I think he came for a week or two and did a lot of analyses. And in discussing these analyses, we published a few papers from these analyses. And Rolf at one point told me, it's very important to study aggression. And I remember that word, that phrase, was important at the time, and we're sort of 30 years later, and I could not imagine at the time that I would focus so much on aggression, because there were many other things that I was interested in. So Rolf played an important role in my focus on these issues. And Dan came along and said, here's another way of analyzing the data. Because with Rolf, we had tried to do trajectory analyses in a very simple way. And Dan came along, I guess, 10 years later and said, listen, guys, there's another way of doing this, which is more sophisticated. The idea that we need experiment, I'm absolutely convinced, and I think you've heard what I said yesterday in the opening session to the minister. But Dan has just mentioned natural experiments. And one of the obvious natural experiments that we can use also, and that is being used, and that we are starting to use more in criminology, is twin studies. Twins are natural experiments in the sense that we have twins that are identical genetically and other twins that are that have only 50% of their genes, and so they are like brothers and sisters, and they are generally brought up in the same environment. So Dan's comment made me realize that it's important to repeat that one of the natural experiments, in fact, this natural experiment was highlighted by Darwin's cousin, who was Darwin's cousin. I'm blocking on his Galton. It's amazing that he had this idea at the end of the 19th century, and for a long time it sort of stayed. People did not really study twins in a systematic way, and it just restarted in the 1960s, and I think in criminology there's a little bit more of these studies. Whatever else I could say about what this session, I will say this afternoon. And as I've often said when university authorities ask me to teach, I've always said I can't speak intelligently for more than an hour, so I can't teach. And since I'll be talking for 40 minutes this afternoon, I don't want to repeat myself. So I'm going to ask, do you have questions? Do you have comments for these talks that we've just heard? Okay, so we will end it here, and we'll take a rest for the next session. Thank you.